George W. Bush, the mother of all Egypts, as we say in Glasgow. That reminds me, though, of one of the epic episodes of my life, which was my appearance in front of the US Senate in the summer of 2005. A long time ago now, but still one of the great YouTube hits. It has received millions of hits on YouTube in the tens, maybe scores of appearances that it has made on YouTube, and it's still taught in not just schools and universities, but taught in business seminars. Recently I went to Edinburgh to talk to a company there based on that video of my appearance in front of the US Senate. The backdrop to it is something I think useful for you to know. And with me now is the man who was with me then, and indeed has been with me since the summer of 1977. Yes, 1977. Wives have come and gone for both of us. Children have grown up, got married, had children. But he and I will always be together. He's Mr. Ron Mackay. Ron, welcome to the Mother of All Christmas podcasts.
Thank you, George. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's just talk about that, first of all, how we met. We came upon each other in Lebanon, in Beirut, or in the hills above Beirut, to be more precise, amongst the eucalyptus trees. I can still smell them, still hear the twitter of birdsong and the clatter of heavy weaponry.
Yes.
You and I were there for a period of, I think, 2 weeks together in Beirut, visiting the Palestinian refugee camps and the Palestinian Revolution. We met all the leaders of the Palestinians there in Beirut. Some things never change. One of them is the friendship that we made there. The other is the bloodshed in Beirut. I've just come back, actually, from Beirut this week. And whilst we were there, in fact, whilst we were at a big and very impressive function for the Algerian revolutionary, Jamila, the famous Algerian woman who had been tortured and became an icon of the Algerian Revolution. Whilst we were in the theatre at that event, one of the top leaders of Hezbollah was assassinated outside his house in the suburbs of Beirut. So some things never change, and I'm afraid the agony of Beirut is one of those. But you came to be with me in the summer of 2005 in front of the US Senate in that great committee room where the McCarthyite witch hunt hearings had been. Just tell us what you recall of the lead up to that event, if you would.
Yes, George. I remember having a very uncomfortable night sleeping on the floor just before we went off. And then the media circus that followed us to the airport and onwards and over to the States. And indeed the circus that greeted us when we got there. I think you'll remember that we were booked into a hotel that I think we'd done it on the internet. I can't remember the name of it.
It sounded like an impressive address, but what we didn't know is that it was the longest street in Washington, and it started off salubrious and grew increasingly insalubrious as we drove down it.
Remember, we were warned not to go outside after dark in case we might get shot, and I thought it was exaggerated. You know, when you go to hotels and sometimes you get bathrobes, but when you got flak jackets like there, it wasn't.
This was the manager of the hotel who advised us as his guests not to step foot out of the hotel after darkness, because Washington, of course, can be quite a hairy place. People imagine it's the White House and the Capitol Hill, but of course the vast majority of the people of Washington, D.C. have absolutely nothing to do with the governance of the United States. I remember there was the only shop that was open in the vicinity, which made me conclude that I wouldn't have wanted to go out anyway, was an off-licence.
Right across the road,
Yeah, which looked like Fort Knox.
It did,
I mean, you actually had to go through a security capsule to get inside the shop.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you recall, in the middle of the night, my my toilet overflowed with other people's excrement. And I mean overflowed. Yeah. It didn't just fill the cistern, it burst its banks and spilled onto the floor of my bathroom. So I didn't get much sleep that night.
Well, I remember in the morning when we came down, you came in very indignant, saying, do something about my toilet, it's overflowing. There's excrement everywhere. We had gone out the night before, hadn't we? And we had hired a taxi guy to take us to the Senate the next morning. And I remember that we had an interview with Clive Myrie. He was the first...
Yes, he was the first black correspondent, wasn't he?
He was, yeah.
In the BBC. He was in the Washington Bureau at that time. And I remember we went somewhere for breakfast and he interviewed us. None of us knowing that this event would become quite the media event that it became. None of us knowing that it was going to be shown live on television stations like BBC, like Sky, like Al Jazeera, CNN. None of us knew that it was going to be quite as big as it turned out. So we had that breakfast, I remember, and I thought we were doing what would probably be the only interview of the day with him and the BBC crew. And then we arrived at the Senate to be met by whom?
Mr. Christopher Hitchens was on the pavement, wasn't he?
He was indeed.
Among a scrum.
Yes, and I spotted him marching towards me, not least because he was sporting a huge Kurdish flag badge on his lapel, which was over broad, I first noted. He was a man who didn't follow fashion particularly well in any respect, sartorially. And he marched towards me with this rather broad lapel and a huge Kurdish flag badge on it. And then I looked at his face and saw that it was indeed he. And he'd brought his own cameras with him to record the moment when he stepped forward to insult me and he thought interrogate me. But I'm rather proud of the line that I instantly came out with. I described him as a bloated, drink-soaked, former Trotskyite popinjay, which, as an instant reaction, wasn't half bad.
It was terrific. It certainly shut him up, didn't it?
Yeah, because veritas, it was undeniably true on every count. But he dogged our steps as we went into the Senate. And when we got in there, I remember it was quite daunting. The battery of cameras that were there, the majesty of the building, the knowledge that some terrible things had happened in that very room. As someone who studied the McCarthyite witch hunt period in the United States, not academically studied, but in an amateur way, being very familiar with the McCarthy method, I began to psych myself into a position of the defendants, if you like, who were under accusations in that very room from McCarthy. And thus my very first line was, "Senator, I am not now, nor have I ever been, an oil trader, and neither has anyone on my behalf." And this was, of course, an echo of the stock response of those being witch-hunted by McCarthy, which was, "I am not now, nor have I ever been a communist."
Do you remember beforehand when we were waiting for you to go on, and the batteries of cameras everywhere and people milling around, and you whispered to me, "Do you know where the toilet is?" And we went to the toilet, and the room emptied, and all of the cameras followed
us to the toilet. That's right. I don't know if they ever showed that footage. X-rated.
Yes.
But yeah, that was a remarkable thing. I should say that during the night, I got up very early with the jet lag and so on. And in the middle of the night, I recall sitting in this really shady hotel room opposite the Fort Knox off-licence. Day had just broken, I think. And I remember thinking, as you know, I used to be a boxer, and I remember thinking through how I was going to approach the hearing in boxing terms. I decided that I wouldn't try to be Muhammad Ali, nothing too fancy, nothing too flamboyant. But I decided also not to be Mike Tyson, which I can be, not to come out flailing, not to be wildly hitting out at the interrogators that were to come. I focused on the persona, the ring persona, of Rocky Marciano, who, in my view, was definitely the second greatest heavyweight that there's ever been. And his stock in trade was unremitting blows. Not wild, not flamboyant, just blow after blow after blow. And I really tried to keep the psyche of Marciano, or what I imagined to be the psyche of Marciano, in that whole episode that then followed. So anyway, there's you, me, and another of our then colleagues, Asad Rehman. We're captured forever on celluloid. I don't know if you know who was sat right behind me. Do you know that?
You've told me this lately, which is quite incredible.
It's quite startling. Sat right behind me, and therefore in full view of the cameras throughout, is Mark Regev, nowadays the ubiquitous apologist for Israeli war crimes, broadcasting from Tel Aviv, a South African Israeli, without a single trace either in his name, his face, or anything about his culture of the Middle East, but the voice of Israel whenever there's a war. But in those days, he was a media counselor at the Israeli embassy in Washington, and he'd clearly been sent along to witness what he hoped would be my political demise. But it didn't quite turn out that way. But he's there, captured in the video throughout. He sat impassively, I may say, throughout. So he's definitely a proper professional. But that is indeed who he was. There's also a woman sat behind me, an American Jewish woman who had emigrated back to the United States with her Glasgow husband. And her facial characteristics during the whole hearing are really remarkable. And they featured, I think, on Have I Got News for You. They show her, she was very supportive, but they show her apparently in paroxysms of delight, if I can put it politely in that way, at how the session unfolded. Continuing the boxing metaphor, and you'll recall this very well, because we were up close and personal with ex-Senator Norman Coleman throughout the event. When you're a boxer, you know from the other fellow's eyes when he no longer wants to be there. In boxing, of course, your trainer can throw in the white towel, and that's the end of the bout. But when all the major television networks are filming it live, there's no possibility of throwing in the towel. And so ex-Senator Norman Coleman had to sit there. Tell us a bit about him.
Well, he's one of these turncoats, wasn't he? He was a Democrat who became a Republican.
He was an anti-war Democrat, an anti-Vietnam War, long-haired, cannabis-smoking Democrat.
There are certain analogies one could draw with some British politicians, I think, in that.
Indeed, yes. But he became a neocon.
He did. Got himself elected until he was replaced by another comedian, wasn't he?
Yeah. What's that comedian's name again? I can't remember. No. We'll get some of our brain boxes.
Al Franken?
Al Franken. That's right.
Yeah.
Very humorous writer. He's now the senator although I haven't heard a word about him since he was elected. But I did actually go to Minnesota and campaign for him. Yeah. I campaigned for him and was able to witness the defenestration of the aforementioned Norman Coleman. Maybe we'll come back to that. But on the day, he started that day as a presidential hopeful.
Absolutely, and it didn't last more than 2 or 3 minutes after he got throwing the verbal punches. I mean, I think we can hear some of the Senate. I think we can, yeah.
Let's go to that.
Yeah.
If the world had listened to me and the anti-war movement in Britain, we would not be in the disaster that we're in today. Senator, This is the mother of all smokescreens. You are trying to divert attention from the crimes that you supported, from the theft of billions of dollars of Iraq's wealth. Have a look at the real oil for food scandal. Have a look at the 14 months you were in charge of Baghdad, the first 14 months, when $8.8 billion of Iraq's wealth went missing on your watch. Have a look at Halliburton and the other American corporations that stole not only Iraq's money, but the money of the American taxpayer. Have a look at the oil that you didn't even meter, that you were shipping out of the country and selling, the proceeds of which went who knows where. Have a look at the $800 million you gave to American military commanders to hand out around the country without even counting it or weighing it. Have a look at the real scandal breaking in the newspapers today, revealed in the earlier testimony in this committee, that the biggest sanctions busters were not me or Russian politicians or French politicians. The real sanctions busters were your own companies with the connivance of your own government.
There wasn't really a way back from all of that, if I say so myself. I did all this without notes, as you very well know. The senators had volumes of notes, and one presumes they had prepared copiously for the event, but they were, I think, quite quickly out of their depths. They had never written to me, telephoned me, emailed me, asked me a single question. Before, the week before that hearing, they pronounced me guilty of profiting from the Oil for Food program. I recall very well getting a telephone call from a media source on the day that they had done that. And I remember calling you and saying, we really must go to Washington. So I actually arrived at Heathrow. I was on the conveyor back in towards the baggage terminal when I got that call. And I more or less just stopped to collect my toothbrush, and we were on the plane to Washington because I insisted on being heard. I said, you have traduced my name in front of the world without ever having made a single call to me, without my even knowing that you were looking at me, investigating me. And as I said to Senator Coleman at the time, I know that standards have slipped around here, but for a lawyer, you're remarkably cavalier with any idea of justice. And I think that we proved that fairly powerfully. One of the things, though, that sticks out from looking at the YouTube video of the Senate appearance is how different the numbers now are. I think I referred at the time in 2005 to a death rate amongst American soldiers, which multiplied at least 4 times before the end of the physical American occupation of the country. And of course, now people are dying like flies in Iraq. Actually, more people die every day in Iraq than die in Syria, where the world is fixated on the war there. And this is more than 10 years after the invasion and occupation. So, however I described the scale of Coleman and his team's disaster, it was, of course, to become dwarfed.
I think it was 1800 at the time, or 1600.
Something like that, yeah. And it became, and of course, if you factor in not just the American soldiers who died, but the American soldiers who were maimed and wounded, the American soldiers that came back so damaged that they murdered other people, their wives and children and strangers, when they got back, or the number of American soldiers now mentally disturbed by their experience there, the number of US soldiers now living on the streets from that war, the number in penitentiaries. I mean, the scale of the disaster. As I put it to Coleman, if you had listened to us, we would not be in the disaster that we are now in, and 1 million people in Iraq would now not be dead. So we dusted them up, rather. They were flat on their backs. It was a definitely a knockout, more than a technical knockout, a real flattening, I thought. And I was very proud at the end of it, and I know that you were too, because although we've been friends for almost 40 years, we are British at the end of the day. And until that day, we had never actually kissed each other. But I remember you giving me a kiss at the end of the proceedings, so I then knew that it had gone very well indeed, because with you it's normally a dry handshake and maybe a pat on the shoulder. But I don't know if you recall, when we stepped out the door, the first person we encountered was a black janitor working in the building. And I remember vividly his exact words. He said, "Way to go, man. You just sent George Bush back to his ranch." Yes. Which was as good an introduction to how well it had gone as was possible. And it was only then when I did the first interview, the BBC interview, and Sir Mingus Campbell was in the studio responding to what I was saying. He'd watched for the BBC the whole proceedings, and I became aware of how sensationally it had gone down in the UK media, which of course is habitually extremely hostile to me. But were you surprised by the impact that it made?
Well, to go back a little bit, you'll recall that there was a bit of a media storm in Britain over it, because you had been presumed guilty by the Americans, and it was mayhem for 24 hours or so before we flew out. But that changed completely after 10 minutes, because I think you got 10 or 20 minutes to speak.
Yeah, it's probably about 12, 13.
And then from the hostility, it was approbation and a complete utter volte-face in public opinion. I mean, even enemies were congratulating you.
Yes.
It was quite stunning.
I had all sorts of reports that in the TV departments of big department stores, everything had come to a halt, and everyone was gathered round the television sets on sale in these department stores, and stood riveted to the whole thing. I know that in the House of Commons, everyone who was in their offices and therefore within reach of a television, hundreds of MPs watched it. I must say, even now, it's difficult to fully grasp the impact that it made. It became clear that it had been everywhere received as a tremendous victory for us, a tremendous defeat for Coleman and the neocon hawks. People started comparing it to really historic occasions, like the speech of Dimitrov at the end of the trial over the burning of the Reichstag in Hitler's Germany, which had hitherto been regarded as the greatest sort of courtroom performance by a political figure. People started comparing it to things like that. And indeed, it was my plan to stay in Washington another day or two, but that's right. I changed my flight because the Stop the War Coalition, of which I was then and am now the vice president, the Stop the War Coalition wanted to put on a public rally and strike while the iron was hot. So I flew overnight, you'll recall.
I do, yeah.
Mr. Zabadny helped us with that. And he received me at the airport at Heathrow and took me to his farm in Sussex to sort of unwind after the flight before going to the rally. He's in my mind because he called me this morning for the first time in some years, and I do have to return that call. Sorry, Mr. Zabadny. I will do it after this broadcast, I promise. When I got to Friends Meeting House, and again, this footage is available on YouTube. When I got to Friends Meeting House on the Euston Road in London, I've never seen a crowd like it. I mean, talk about a hero's welcome. I mean, people were hanging from the rafters. It was absolutely packed with thousands of people. And as I entered through the back door to walk through the crowd to the platform, it was simply overwhelming. It was a wave of support and I mean, it's quite emotional even to recall it now. Everyone was so enthralled by what had happened. So a disaster, something that had been intended to kill me, turned out instead to be something that really took me to a whole other level. And I remember there's footage of it actually crying on the platform of that rally that evening. Simply unforgettable. I mean, a lot of the people that are there now hate me now, but that's just the way politics goes. They're captured on that film when they loved me, when we were kings. That's when we were kings, Ron.
That's right, George.
It was a great day, and I do think that listeners should go now or later after this podcast and look at some of these pictures again. It brings back very happy memories.
He's got the same epic good looks as Che Guevara.
I don't think so.
The same persuasive.